Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. IRS provides guidance on the deductibility and reporting of certain amounts paid to or at the direction of governments. IR 2020-94, May 12, 2020, Washington. The Internal Revenue Service today issued proposed regulations. There's a link to those proposed regulations here. There'll be a link to this in the description back to the text under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, TCJA, that provide guidance to taxpayers and governments with respect to fines, penalties, and certain other amounts. The TCJA disallows a deduction for the payment of fines, penalties, and certain other amounts. And this is kind of in alignment with what you would typically think from the IRS. In other words, they're usually not going to allow deductibility for fines. You would think that that would be because that would be kind of incentivizing bad behavior. So if they're trying to fine you, they're trying to fine you for something they perceive as bad. And then if you got a deduction for it, that would kind of undermine that. So typically, the rule would be that if it's a penalty, you can't usually deduct it. But the interest related to it that would accumulate on it, you may be able to deduct the interest related to it, but not the actual penalty. Now, when you think about laws that are happening now, there might be other restrictions that are coming into play, and some of them you would think that why would it be deductible, you might ask? When would a penalty be deductible in the first place? Well, possibly if it was like a business expense, something that you would typically be able to deduct. In other words, if you had a cost, such as a fine in the course of running your business, you would think that normally it would fall under a business expense unless specifically said otherwise, such as fines typically by the IRS, fines from the IRS not typically being deductible. But then, of course, you have the question of, well, what if the government is asking me to make this change or do something, right? Then the question is, well, is that a fine, which is not deductible because it's a penalty? Or is it some kind of thing that I need to do basically to make a change that's not basically a fine and something that would be part of, for example, a business expense and therefore something that would be deductible? So as some of these laws and changes come into place where governments are basically saying you need to do this or that possibly, then the question is, do I interpret that as a fine, which I can't deduct, or something that I simply need to do as part of my business and can deduct? If it's in the classification of fines, you would think that you couldn't deduct it, right? And if it's in the classification of something that's a normal business expense under new rules and regulations or something like that, then you would think that you could. So that's just kind of my basically recap of some of the issues related to the fines back to the text. Specifically, taxpayers may not deduct amounts that, pursuant to court orders or settlement agreements, are paid to or at the direction of governments in relation to the violation of any law or the investigation or inquiry into the potential violation of any law. So if there's a law violation and it's basically, especially if the penalty is there that's in a kind of a punitive way, it's there because of a violation of a law, then that would specifically be a penalty and not typically deductible. Under the TCJA, the disallowance may not apply to amounts that taxpayers establish and court orders or settlement agreements identify are paid as restitution, remediation, or to come into compliance with a law. So if it's restitution, remediation, or if you're paying it to get into compliance with the law, because, I mean, if you're not in compliance and they say, hey, now you have to be in compliance, here's the fine, you might have a fine proportion to it and say the fine itself, the penalty, you would think would be a penalty. But the steps you need to take to basically do whatever you need to do to become in compliance, you would think would be part of the normal business setting. So the question is, if it falls into this category, restitution, remediation, or to come into compliance with the law, so long as the amounts otherwise qualify as deductible under the Internal Revenue Code. In other words, would it have been deductible before without considering whether or not is it a penalty or not? And again, if it's a business-related expense, if it's something you're doing in order to maintain the business, you would think that it would generally be deductible unless qualified and specifically said otherwise, such as in the case of a penalty. The proposed regulations describe how taxpayers may meet these requirements and define key terms and phrases such as restitution, remediation, and paid to come into compliance with a law. The TCJA also requires governments to report these amounts to the Internal Revenue Service and taxpayers. The proposed regulations provide guidance to governments related to these reporting requirements. For more information about this and the TCJA provisions, visit the irs.gov/tax form.